There are Buddhist centers like this all around the world, where people come to meditate, study, practice ritual and meet friends. What are the roots of this particular movement, the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order? The early history of the FWBO can be pieced together from hearing people's experiences from the 60s and 70s. Nearly 30 years ago in London, Mike Rogers picked up a copy of Edwin Arnold's 1879 poem, The Light of Asia.
And when I had gone through it, I thought to myself, well, I think I am sort of more or less a Buddhist from having read that book. So I went to the Telephone Directory and looked up Buddhism. I found the Buddhist Society, so I rushed off and joined the Budzog. And they used to have lectures, I think, every Wednesday night or something like this, and a variety of people came along and gave what they thought was their view of certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy.
The Buddhist Society of Great Britain, established in the 1920s, was an important centre for the study and practice of all schools of Buddhism.
Another person who impressed me very much was Professor Gonzo. I went to one of his presentations at Saffron Walden when he was lecturing on the Heart Sutra. There were several hundred people present, including a number of monks, and it was really one of the most incredible performances I've ever been to. He's so entertaining and so witty, and what with his astrology and other things. Someone would ask a question and he would say, it's a typical question from a bleeding Virgo, if I may say so, and the questioner would almost swoon. How on earth do you know it was a Virgo? It's difficult for foreign Buddhist monks to communicate effectively, I find, with the British audience. And I've been to meetings at the Thai Buddhist temple where Thai monks, even those who've been in this country for some time, gave presentations, but their English was generally so poor that they couldn't get nuances of meaning across, and so on. Didn't get so much from the lectures.
Over the years, a handful of Westerners had gone east to gain first-hand experience of living Buddhism. Now, one of them was returning to British shores.
Dennis Lingwood, who embarked for India with the army as a youth of 19 in 1944, has returned to London as head of the first chapter of European Buddhist monks to be established in England. Signaller Lingwood, now 39, has become the Venerable Sangharakshita Stavira, author, poet and senior British Buddhist monk.
It wasn't very long before a new speaker who I hadn't heard before had been invited to come along, and I thought he presented the ideas of Buddhism in his several lectures there so well and succinctly and clearly and logically that my interest was rapidly growing. I thought, well, this sounds like the real McCoy.
Sangharakshita has a lean, bespectacled face, honed and tempered by 20 years' spiritual studies and work with Indian untouchables and Tibetan refugees. His headquarters are in a villa on Haverstock Hill, Hampstead.
Then I found he was incumbent up at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, so my steps headed northwards up to Haverstock Hill, and where he was giving regular Sunday lectures to a crowd of keen followers, and I got more and more interested.
My life at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara was a very busy one, consisting mainly of taking classes, delivering lectures, and seeing people individually. And those activities usually filled up my week very well. I also visited quite regularly all the little outlying Buddhist groups.
150 people came together this weekend at a country house in Hertfordshire for the 13th annual Buddhist Summer School.
Attending the summer schools quite often were people who weren't Buddhists, but who spent the whole summer, it seemed, going from one summer school to another.
And as different people would get up and give their views on all sorts of different subjects. So it wasn't a bad beginning for anybody interested in Buddhism to get different people's views on what it was all about. As I say, we can only judge things in the light of our own best ignorance at any one particular time.
At the very first summer school, I asked Mr. Humphreys if he minded if I conducted a little puja one evening. Puja meaning an act of Buddhist devotion, and he said, well, English Buddhists weren't into that sort of thing, but if I really wanted to, well, he supposed I could, and a few people might turn up. So I announced that I'd be holding this puja in the evening, and virtually everybody turned up.
With Mandarava, Blue Lotus and Jasmine.
And they seemed very much to enjoy it, so this made it clear to me that ritual and devotion were very much were one of the missing links in the Buddhism of those days.
Relations between the two Buddhist bodies, the Hampstead Vihara and the Buddhist Society, had been strained. Added to this, the Vihara had its own internal difficulties.
Haverstock Hill had a slightly up and down history, and several Buddhist monks had been incumbents there, but they each in turn seemed to have fallen out with the trust or the lay organizer, shall we say, behind the place. Horace Walsh and the other trustees.
The aim of the Hampstead Vihara was to establish an English branch of the Southeast Asian Order of Monks, or Sangha. The Buddhist Society, on the other hand, had its broad church approach. To heal the differences, Sangharakshita worked in both places and gave over 200 talks.
And in both places, my activities were really quite successful and very much appreciated. Appreciated also, I must say, by Christmas Humphreys himself. But it did transpire later that some people, including some who didn't actually attend, were not quite happy with a few things. I mean, some people weren't very happy that I'd allowed my hair to grow just a wee bit longer than might be considered customary. It was only 2 or 3 inches, but even so it was longer. But I think perhaps the more serious issue, and which might have been fairly decisive eventually, was the fact that I had criticized a particular form of meditation, which I did not consider a genuinely Buddhist form of meditation, because I had seen that it led to a state of extreme alienation and even mental disturbance in the case of some of the people who had practiced it. Some of them indeed had to be hospitalized. So I gradually phased out that kind of meditation from the Vihara, and that of course did upset some people.
But not everyone was put off.
He was real. I had met 1 or 2 remarkable people in my life, but nobody who was quite so incontrovertibly, ineluctably real.
By the end of my 2 years at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, it was clear that a new Buddhism, at least a new presentation of Buddhism, was needed in the West, and I decided to stay on in Britain.
Sangharakshita's 4-month invitation to the UK had already grown to a couple of years. But before he could settle, he needed to bid farewell to friends in India. During his tour, he stayed at his old Vihara, met up with the Dalai Lama, and addressed a meeting of 250,000 ex-untouchables.
I went back to India for, I think it was a 4-month period. I toured around. I visited my ex-untouchable Buddhist friends in Bombay, in Pune, in Nagpur, and other places. I visited my teachers. I visited Jagdish Kashyap. I visited Dilbar Khyentse Rinpoche. I visited, of course, Dardu Rinpoche in Kalimpong and Mr. Chen in Kalimpong. And later on, I visited also Lama Govinda, though technically he wasn't one of my teachers, but I always admired him and his work.
Whilst the Indian tour continued, at London Airport, Soviet Premier Kosygin was saying goodbye. The monkeys were saying hello. The Torrey Canyon was shedding offshore oil. Prince Charles was inspecting his new college, and the Observer newspaper enlightened readers on the deepening crisis in Hampstead.
A major row is likely to develop among Britain's 3,000 Buddhists over the sacking of the Venerable Stavira Sangharakshita. His supporters claim that he criticised Buddhism as interpreted in Britain, and that this provoked the resentment which led to his dismissal.
My teachers were all very supportive, and even when I told them that the English Sangha Trust had decided not to renew my invitation, they told me not to bother. They seemed to think that of no significance or importance whatever, and just urged me to carry on with my work in England. When I opened their letter, I said to someone who was with me, "Do you know what this means? This means a new Buddhist movement." I knew that instantly. I saw that, well, there, as it were, was an opening.
Though he realised 95% of the Sangha Association were campaigning on his behalf, Sangharakshita had other plans.
Horrified by the prospect of a return to spiritual starvation, I became a fervent activist in the pro-Bhante faction. The first meeting of the Friends of the Western Sangha was held in a flat in Coptic Street, near the British Museum, early in 1967. There were 9 people present, including Bhante, who had just arrived back in England.
They produced a document called Aims and Objects, of which 2 were to study all strands of Buddhism and to get classes up and running. First, they needed some premises.
Emile Boyne, one of our number, ran a shop in Monmouth Street, specialising in the sale of Buddhist objects. It was called Sakura. We decided to rent a small unoccupied room in the basement and convert it into a meditation centre, and the Triratna Meditation and Shrine Room was publicly dedicated on the evening of the 6th of April. The small room was crowded out. Bhante compared it to the catacombs.
At this time, most travellers to the east were unaware of any Buddhism going on in a London basement. In Asia, though, the glorious legacy of Buddhism was clearly visible, as was a storehouse of literature called the Pali Canon.
Yes, it gave a very direct feeling of the Buddha and his disciples, because the Pali Canon is about the Buddha and his disciples and him going around and talking and teaching and the little incidents that happened. I discovered that, puzzling over words like dukkha and enlightenment and so on, I began to feel that this is a possible thing. Enlightenment is possible in this life.
I think it was very simple things that sparked me off, like seeing the mudras of the Buddha figures. I mean, just seeing a hand in the mudra of fearlessness or giving evoked some quite deep feelings within me that urged me towards finding out what was behind it.
I'd come across some Lobsang Rempa books, and that gave me sort of an introduction to Tibet and Tibetan things in general, and sort of teachings of Tibet.
Coming upon Christmas Humphrey's book was an eye-opener for a reader who then had a chance meeting at Sakura with the friendly Emile Boyne.
In one of my wanderings, I just happened to encounter this Buddhist information shop, as it was called, Sakura, in Monmouth Street, which was a very kind of fly-balloon shop, very mysterious, full of Japanese things, and very very inviting in a sort of way. It was very warm and mysterious, which is what the kind of things I was looking for in a way. I was needing warmth, you know, and mystery in my life, which is dominated by the BBC so much.
I'd met a guy when I was hitchhiking in Portugal, and we'd sat on the beach and talked for 3 days, and he'd just been recently practicing meditation in America, and talked about it in terms of self-truth. But that impressed me quite a lot, and I wanted to find out about meditation when I came back to England. I didn't know where or how.
Then I met again one of the people I'd been to Thailand with, and he said, "Did you know there's a guy teaching meditation at a place in Monmouth Street?" "It's great," he said. "You want to go?" So I went.
He told me about this monk who was giving a lecture in Kensington about Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he'd gone to that, and he was giving other lectures each week. And that's when I first went along and saw Bhante for the first time.
On one of my trips to this shop for 3 cups of tea was this monk was sitting in the corner, dressed in a very strange sort of fuzzy garb, gabardine sort of thing. And I thought, hello, who's this joker in the corner? You know? But he seemed to get on well with Emil, so I thought, you know, it must be all right.
These were some of the people who were drawn to Sakura and meditation.
He started every meditation class by reciting the Heart Sutra in Sanskrit, which I found very, very moving. And then we would do the mindfulness of breathing or the metta bhavana, and afterwards have a cup of tea and go home and come back next week.
I can remember when the puja and the chanting of the refugees in precepts in particular started. I'd found the rest of the language very flowery, but that bit, which was in a foreign language, just made my hair stand on end.
The meaning for me wasn't important. It was something strange and mysterious and different from English. That was the important thing for me.
For most people, what happened next was just as mysterious, though it was an historic step for Western Buddhism.
At our second or third meeting, he outlined the plan that had been in his mind for some time: the establishment of the Western Buddhist order. It evoked a lot of incomprehension and little enthusiasm. Ordination had no personal meaning for us, and it seemed that the Western Buddhist order was without any exact parallel, east or west.
One thing I was very clear and very certain about: I didn't want to start another Buddhist society. Society with a small s. I wanted to start an order. I wanted to have a movement of committed Buddhists. So the order came into existence a year after the foundation of the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, when a dozen people actually committed themselves to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha and became, as we say, ordained into the Western Buddhist Order, which they thereby helped to found.
There was no build-up to the occasion, just Monmouth Street in the long dusk of a spring evening, discarded newspapers blowing in the breeze and taxis honking outside the window as we waited our turn in the shop. Finally, I was alone with Bhante in the shrine room, adding my offering to those already on the altar, taking the refuges and precepts, given a mantra and a rosary and a name. Looking back, I can only say that a seed was planted that evening, which later began to flower. The following evening we had our public ordination at Centre House at the end of a Sunday seminar. In addition to Bhante, the Sangha was represented by 2 Thai bhikkhus, a Zen monk, and a member of the Arya Maitreya Mandala. It was perhaps the most significant occasion in the history of Buddhism for centuries. As in my own case, a seed had been planted, the first seed of the Sangha in the West. Roy Brewer is 43 years old, but last night he was reborn Kneeling before a statue of the Buddha in an atmosphere thick with incense, Roy also changed his name.
Mrs. Sarah Boyne, a 30-year-old London housewife, was ordained a Buddhist yesterday. The ceremony was performed by the Venerable Stavira Sangarachta, head of Britain's Buddhists. Mrs. Boyne of Coptic Street, Bloomsbury, is believed to be the first British woman ordained into Western Buddhism.
Precepts which you have taken, observe thoroughly and perfectly, and with mindfulness strive on. I didn't think anybody shared my vision at that time. I think that was quite impossible for them to do. A few of them might very occasionally have had a glimpse of it, but no more than that.
No, I really hadn't the slightest idea what ordination was. It was a club, it was a nice, friendly, warm, social club, really, which seemed to be based on something a bit different from English culture.
Freshly ordained, Ananda went back to work at the BBC, where one day he made a new connection.
At one tea break, I was actually asked if Ananda knew where I could buy any incense, and he told me of Sakura. And he said, why don't you go along and learn to meditate? And I mean, it never crossed my mind to do so before, but I could see no good reason why not to.
Soon afterwards, and without having been to any classes, she went on a retreat at a rented school in Surrey called Keffolds.
There was a whole sort of atmosphere of trust and security, of sort of sanity, and yet at the same time it's very magical, very light.
I think the first retreat one goes on is quite an experience. And communication exercises and silent days, and the build-up of the meditation. Everybody went round sort of on cloud nine by the end of it.
People started saying, we don't just want to have a retreat every few months. We want this to go on in between. What do we do in between? We don't want to go back to the old lifestyle. We want to sort of keep the energy and inspiration and the magic going. So, people say, well, why don't we get a house together? I remember Brenda, who became GoToMe later, saying, we've got this house in Purley, south of London, and there's a few of people who wanted to get together. Would you like to come and join it? And I thought, oh, we could eat together every day.
Another candidate for this proposed community was Marlene, still only on her first retreat, 18 years old and called Hazel.
So I left home and moved into the first ever Buddhist community, which later became Aryatara, but which at that time was still called Sarum House.
So with our hearts in our mouths, we moved out to Purley, and 3 of us sat on the floor there, put our sleeping bags on the floor and thought, well, here we are.
GoToMe's ordination brought the order up to 18 members. The community at Sarum House was growing. Besides herself, Ananda and Marlene, Chanda joined it, followed by Dharmapala.
I decided that I was just going to move in. I asked him if I could come and live there, and within a month I was actually living in this house with these people. So I'd made that sort of connection that I felt was missing. I just found GoToMe very, very encouraging, and the other order members very encouraging. And in the evenings we'd do sometimes just sitting in the shrine and chanting. So there's a sort of beginnings of a sort of like centre thing happening there other than Sakura.
A fire at Sakura meant classes had to be cancelled for a while. When they started back, there were 5 of them a week. Teachers from various schools came and taught, though when some of the disciples started living at Sarum House, life there became unwieldy.
It got to a point where we had some of Jiro Roshu's disciples there, people from Soshu, Suzuki, some who had Tibetan teachers, some who had Sri Lankan teachers, all living in the same house.
After some of the confusion had been sorted, Sarum House became the Aryatara community and the first Croydon Buddhist centre.
After I'd been living at Sarum House for about a year, Gotami just told me one day that Bhante wanted to ordain me on the next retreat, which rather surprised me. I didn't actually know what that meant, so I had to ask Gotami, well, what does this mean? You know, that I'm going to be ordained, or he wants to ordain me. What does it mean? And she explained about the refugees and the 3 jewels to me, and I just said, well, okay, that seems all right to me.
While I was on retreat, Bhante asked me if I'd like to go for a walk. So I went for a walk with him, and he asked me if I would like to get ordained. And I simply asked him what that entailed. I mean, I didn't really have much of a clue about what it meant. And my memory was that he just said that ordination was that I had made, that I wanted to make a commitment to leading a Buddhist life. And that's what I was thinking of doing for the rest of my life. And to me that seemed, well, yes, that was what I intended doing. And so I agreed. I said, yes, I would like to go for refuge to be ordained.
In 1969, with the ordinations of Dharmapala in Harini, the order had 25 members. But it was a fragile affair, and only a handful of them would turn up for weekly order meetings at Sangharakshita's flat.
And I think many, like Friday afternoon, Friday evenings, which is when we had them, I don't think Bhante really believed people would turn up at all, you know.
It was quite a shock to me when later order members started taking classes. I mean, it never occurred to me that that is what an order member would be expected to do. At that time I still thought Bhante would be doing everything forever.
There were more people wanting to go to meditation classes than Bhante could take, so he decided that 1 or 2 people should be taking them instead. And we all felt dithery, and he said, well, you know the mindfulness breathing, you know the metta bhavana, you know the stages, you know what to say. So we did.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
Dr. Timothy Leary, a high priest of youth culture, did know what to say. We should go back a couple of years to 1967, the year of love, and trace another route of the FWBO. For those young enough to appreciate it, there was a dawning new age. Reading Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums when he was 13 deeply influenced the future Manju Vajra.
And the things that impressed me with that book were, well, the sexual experimentation which was going on, which I was keen to try, the drugs, and the levels of consciousness that it opened up, and Buddhism, and travel.
I went to America in 1967. You remember 1967 when we all wore flowers in our hair. And that was a big turning point for me. Hung around in Haight-Ashbury, talking to people, smoking dope, etc. Just sort of experiencing the atmosphere, which was quite extraordinary.
I mean, I felt like committing myself to the world of drugs. What I meant was to say, okay, let's just go for this level of consciousness. Not worry about the ordinary world, but really pursue that particular level, no matter what, whether it turns me into a wreck or whatever.
The good experiences were that, you know, I felt there was more to life than science, and more to life than being rational.
And I was working at the BBC at the time, and I couldn't quite take it seriously. And I felt I'd have to take it seriously in order to get the satisfaction I wanted, but I couldn't make that shift, so I was looking for something.
And I thought, I've got to get out of this. This is, you know, I could end up like my parents, you know, who got their gold watch in the Shackles fitted chain when they retired, and I didn't want it. So, and you know, there was exciting things to do, like, you know, tour the cosmos.
Are you experiencing the subtler state of thought at this moment?
No, I am out in the grot speaking to you.
Having experienced altered states of consciousness with drugs, I became interested in doing that without drugs. And in fact, I thought that was quite necessary and you know, desirable. And so I set about looking for somebody to teach me meditation.
we always used to listen to the programmes while we were doing other things, and I heard it mentioned on the Today programme, and so I tracked down the tape, and it had said what I thought, which was that there was a class in Monmouth Street that evening, and I couldn't go, so I sent my boyfriend Subhuti along.
There was a very, very uncomfortable sort of atmosphere, I suppose what we would now call blocked, and at the end there was this strange figure dressed in an orange robe, and he seemed to be completely unconcerned and quite at his ease, which I think actually sort of made everybody else even more uneasy. Yeah, I found the meditation very, very good, very effective.
Quite glad of the tea break, and we had sandwiches, which I'm always under the impression that Banti had made, but nobody else seems to ever mention this, so I don't know if he just seemed particularly benevolent and likely to produce sandwiches.
What a man! With just such a mind on him, and at the same time so human and yeah, sort of wild, dangerous. Very self-confident he appeared. So he made a very, very strong impact on me, a very strong impression.
I realised I was a Buddhist within just a few weeks of coming along to those meditation classes, and I knew that this is what I wanted to devote the rest of my life to. Didn't have any great sort of sense of conversion, it was just quite a matter-of-fact thing.
It was great. I booked for 2 days. I thought that was really brave and stayed for 4. And I liked it. I learned to meditate, which I really wanted, and that I could see that was going to be helpful for me.
Well, they're sitting there for 10 minutes or so, and then another bell went, and I thought, oh, thank goodness for that. But nobody moved. And they stayed there for another 10 minutes, and then another bell went, and I was sure this was going to be the end, but it wasn't. And this went on 5 times until we actually got to the end of the practice. And I didn't know what I was doing. I'd just gone there and sat there for nearly 50 minutes of excruciating pain.
I liked the people. There was a lot of young people, but there were all ages actually. There was little old ladies and people middle-aged, so I liked the range of people. I met Subhuti on that retreat and various other people that I've been friends with since.
And immediately, in the course of just the 4 days that we went for that retreat, we built some really good friendships that have lasted actually until now.
And I remember arriving back at Waterloo Station at the end of it, and how everything just seemed so strange. You're sitting on the platform with a few friends before we went our different ways, and just watching people walk past, like especially women, they come walking past in these high-heeled shoes and short skirts and all this ridiculous makeup, and it just seems so absurd, after what you've been used to on these retreats. It just, what on earth are they doing? What type of world are they living in?
Some painters of the 60s plundered the wealth of consumerist images in their culture and drew out a potent mythology.
That was, for me, what consciousness expansion meant. It meant that, like in my house, we didn't have pictures. I had a picture of my great-aunt Rose and my grandfather on a camel in front of the Sphinx in his Royal Engineers uniform. And we didn't have books. We had the Daily Mirror and the News of the World, And the friend I was living with said we ought to try meditation, so we went to Monmouth Street Centre and all that, and there I met Banti. Quite liked him, he's sort of interesting guy, and in the end invited me to go and live with him and another guy up at St James's Lane. Banti and I would usually take a stroll on Sunday morning. We'd go to the Jewish patisserie and buy a breakfast. He would go to his little room, which was next to mine, and he would, work away at the Eightfold Path series or the Higher Evolution series 1 and 2. And then lunchtime, one of us would cook lunch and sit around and just sort of chat about D.H. Lawrence or something. It was very, very intellectual. Really good. And then of an evening, we might go to a movie, because Kevin used to support himself by being a cleaner at a local ABC, so he always, we could get all of us in there for free.
Tomorrow he learns what's true and what's not. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. Eh?
Or we go for a walk, or we have visitors, quite a lot of visitors.
How did you find that?
I thought I was pretty smart in those days. A rather sort of cocky young art student, you know, with sort of intellectual pretensions. And so obviously we had a lot of discussion about all sorts of things, and it soon became clear, like, who was the intellectual and who wasn't. And I remember sort of leaving one afternoon after a sort of a weekend sort of session, as it were, and just going away, not quite knowing what I'd learned, but knowing that I'd learned something, but not knowing what it was really, you know, but just something had happened.
Dinner at Sangharakshita's, with its painfully shy guests, could be very testing.
And I'd run down to the opera license, buy a bottle of wine, you know, and sort of calm everybody, or loosen everybody up. And some people were fine, you know, some people would just come in and chat, and it was all very nice, and other people would sit there and you'd groan through this meal with absolute silence.
What we ate was supposedly macrobiotic brown rice and some egg and instant whip for pudding and tomato ketchup, I seem to remember. It didn't seem very macrobiotic to me. But I don't think I said very much, probably. That was how I was.
The FWBO had always celebrated traditional Buddhist festivals, and in 1971 a large hall was hired for Wesak.
About 150 people turned up, which gave me the impression that here was quite a big movement. And it was, the place was packed, and there was this chanting filling the room. It was extraordinary. I mean, it was not something that I would have wanted to go to, but being there in this lovely, friendly, you know, atmosphere in a room with incense smoke and flowers, it was something like I'd never experienced, and I loved it.
The vanishing crowd syndrome was reflected in order gatherings. This 1972 picture can be misleading. Many members turned up for the photograph and then disappeared. No new ordinations were to take place for another 2 years.
There was certainly nothing like the friendship that we find in the order today existing then. And it took me a little while to realise, in fact, that there wasn't really much of an order as we were operating behind Bantu. He used to go on in the classes about the FWBO, about this organisation called the FWBO that used to produce this great newsletter to which I subscribed. But actually it didn't. You know, there was nothing really there. Anyway, what he needed was a few people that could get behind him, more or less full-time, boots and all. And when I saw the need, I tried to respond to it.
There had been a regular FWBO newsletter since 1968.
I virtually did write the newsletter, absolutely, from beginning to end, and typed it and printed it and sent it out to the post. You know, it was a one-man operation.
Most of Sangharakshita's talks had been tape recorded, so the archive was soon a valuable resource.
I remember copying tapes for some peculiar people in New Zealand, you know, and I posted these tapes out, and I didn't know where they were going, I didn't know on earth. So I'd sort of rush up to my bedroom and sort of start these copying and send them out, and they'd end up being the foundation of another group. So the tapes actually were actually seminal, instrumental in getting the FWBO going in other parts of the world.
We know, I'm sure, that it's very difficult to develop spiritually entirely on one's own. The support, at least at the beginning, of a spiritual community, that is of other individuals similarly interested, is very, very helpful. This is not just...
I was not impressed when I just saw him and met him. But the talk he gave was extraordinary, because it was a very kind of scholarly talk in some ways, but at the same time it was quite magically enchanting. And it made quite an impact on me. First of all, Bantu's very presence had a strange impact on me, in that I felt I was about to faint during the first few minutes of the talk. And had I been nearer the door, I would have left, because I felt convinced I was about to keel over in my chair.
And the hush was total, you know, very few people coughed. It was like one of those musical performances you go to at the end, you know, no one claps for 5 minutes. They just... That's it. It was like that. Very, very strong.
It demands, which the group doesn't.
I don't think any of us had ever heard anything quite like it.
The spiritual community
Bantu would answer questions. They were all kind of religious, spiritual questions, actually. You know, what's the nature of enlightenment? Or what's the nature of shunyata? Or what is the one mind? as far as I can remember, there were very few psychological type questions. You know, people didn't seem to focus on their psychological problems at that time. And we'd have a discussion on, you know, on the basis of those kinds of questions. And then a lot of us would go upstairs and go next door to a sort of theatrical type cafe.
British Buddhism had been tied to classes and summer schools. It was respectable, but lacked the freedom and energy that young people wanted. The new generation of mind explorers were going to go deeper in trusting themselves and each other. The path of friendship was another route, perhaps the most valuable one, for Western Buddhists to take.
Subhuti invited us back to his parents' place after the retreat. We were going to stay there for a couple of days, and one day I remember we dropped some acid and we sort of were meandering around the house during the course of the day, and it was a fantastic experience, especially after the retreat. But anyway, we formed what we call the League of Court Lodge. I think we signed some sort of paper, you know, that we would form this sort of secret league and that we'd do something with this Buddhism.
I very quickly learnt to trust Buddhists. We were in similar states of mind and looking for similar things. And I think that was quite marked, really, that the people I met at the centre, or at Sakura, were the people who became my intimates.
I think the development of the spirit of Sangha proceeded hand in hand with the development of the movement itself. We started with centres, or rather with a centre, and people used to come along to the centre, attend classes, they used to attend lectures, but they didn't have very much personal contact. They all went home afterwards. But as we began to hold retreats, and people started spending perhaps a week or even 2 weeks together, and then subsequently, as people themselves started setting up residential spiritual communities, and in this way the spirit of Sangha developed more and more.
By 1971, the typical features of the FWBO were there in outline. Its survival, though, was not at all certain. It had one teacher, one community, and one centre. But Sakura's lease was about to expire, and the search for a new home was going to be a long one. Was there enough inspiration and energy to survive on, or was the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order going to be a footnote to history?
Subhuti and I went off to see some kind of hippie character who was organising a big festival on Parliament Hill Fields. And we decided we'd do something as part of this festival. And then Mangala, who was the artist amongst us, he thought we could make a big papier-mâché Buddha.
I was with a bunch of friends, and we came across this bunch of people all with face paints out of their heads on acid, with a big golden papier-mâché Buddha on top of a van.
And then we had a fun jumble sale with everybody in fancy dress. Papanraja was dressed as a parrot, and Devaraja was dressed as a ballerina. They were very fetching. And it was just fun.
Lots of people came and people got interested in the Friends. And even Banti came and manned a stall once at the jumble sale. He managed to sell a lot of bric-a-brac to a lot of old ladies. So it was a beginning of a more collective participation.
There was a very positive experience of actually working together. It wasn't just that 5 of us, there were lots of other people involved by that time. And just that day, and you know, we all went off to the restaurant afterwards and shared a meal together.
For the very first time, I started to feel that I had found some friends who I could relate to in a dharmic way. And this was actually what I had been looking for.
I didn't want to live life like my parents or anyone else I knew, so I thought this was at least alternative.
There wasn't any sort of big structure, which was out there. It was just us and what we kind of did, whether it was getting a jumble sale together or going on a retreat or whatever.
Once Sakura sort of went down the drain, we realised it was up to us if anything was going to happen, and I think that's when we began to feel, well, actually, there was an awful lot that could be done. But it was sort of quite a woolly vision.
To the limit, one more time. one more